Hi, today I want to talk to you about one of the most fundamental ideas in Ayurveda, and that is how it is that we understand food and nourishment. Because the Ayurvedic view is actually really pretty different than the way that most of us were taught to think about food in the Western culture. So in the West, we often have this focus on numbers, like how many calories are you taking in, how many macronutrients, what are the portion sizes, what are the dietary rules. But in Ayurveda, we ask a very different question. And so it's not just like, what are you eating, but how well are you digesting, absorbing it, and how are you feeling after you eat it? And this shift really changes everything. So let's talk a little bit more about it. So in Ayurveda, there's the three pillars of life, food, which we also know as ahara, and I'll talk a little bit more about ahara because it's also different than our understanding in the West. We also look at sleep, or what's called nidra, and then moderation or balanced living, which is also known as brahmacharya. So of all of these three, food is really considered the most essential because that's our primary form of medicine. And in Ayurveda, we understand food as prana. That is like the life force energy. So when we eat, the goal isn't simply to like eat until we're full or to eat to fill a stomach, but the goal is to nourish all of the tissues of the body, support repair, maintain balance in both like our physical form and our subtle forms of energy. So in food, I think this is really unique. Food in Ayurveda is not just fuel, it's like a sacred ritual that we get to do for ourselves. And the food nourishes really body, mind, and our emotional state as well. So another important concept is that food carries different energetic qualities. And when I was learning this in school, this was one of the most interesting parts of my program. So in Ayurveda, there's sort of these three overall arching qualities. They're also known as the gunas. And so there's sattvic, which is very like balancing and pure and neutral. There's rajasic, which is very stimulating and energizing. And then there's also tamasic, which is heavy and dulling and stuck and kind of stagnant. And so if we're consistently, like as a brief example, if we're consistently eating foods that have more of that tamasic quality, so they're heavier, they're, maybe harder to digest, we may notice that then we start to physically feel more sluggish. We feel heavier. We like maybe are even gaining weight. We have mental fog. There's stagnation in our digestive system. And then conversely, if we're eating a lot of rajasic foods, and so rajasic foods tend to be more like energizing. So you can think about that as like really spicy foods as an example might be really rajasic. And so you start to notice that like when you eat those rajasic foods, like maybe your digestion starts to get really sharp, maybe your anger starts to flare up, and there can be different ways that manifests. So there's a lot of emphasis in Ayurveda on eating more of like a sattvic diet, a really balanced diet. So that falls into like more vegetarian eating. And that's not to say that Ayurveda is only supporting vegetarian or veganism. That's not the case. It's just understanding the different qualities of the foods that you eat and understanding a couple of other principles. So in Ayurveda, we understand that like increases like. So if I already have a lot of rajasic energy, a lot of restlessness, a lot of like kind of always on the move, and then I'm eating foods like popcorn or chips or spicy foods that have a lot of air and a lot of pungency, sharpness, we can see that those qualities are going to start to increase. So how we find balance is through this idea of opposites. And so opposites bring balance. So if I have too much heaviness and I'm really slow and sluggish and I'm not feeling super great and maybe I'm even kind of depressive, like a really basic idea is that you would change some of your diet to some of these more rajasic traits so that you lighten things up and you bring some more energy into your body and into your mind. So one of the other big differences in terms of the West and the Ayurvedic nutrition is how it is that we define nourishment. And so in the Western culture, we often evaluate food based on what it is that we consume. But in Ayurveda, we focus on like what we're actually digesting and how it's absorbed. So two people can eat the exact same meal and say that those meals are very healthy by like the Western standards. And we'll see that we have two very different outcomes between those two people based on their digestive strength. And so you can eat really healthy foods, but if your digestion is weak or irregular, we call it vishma, nourishment really won't reach the full extent of your tissues to get you fully like nourished and developed. And so in Ayurveda, we don't say you are what you eat. We instead say you are what you digest. And so I mentioned this earlier in the talk that another important concept in Ayurveda is that of ahara. And ahara is really looking at all of the inputs that come into your system. And so that includes food and water. It also includes your breath, like emotional experiences, sensory inputs, information, and media. And so if you think about like the environment that you're living in, if there's a lot of pollution, if there's fires, and what you're looking at on your phone or on the TV, especially if you're doing those types of things while you're eating. And so everything that we're consuming has to be digested, right? And so again, like even if somebody is eating like a really nourishing meal, they're having like this idea of like a really healthy meal for them. They think that it's very healthy. They're still experiencing or they're living in a state that's really chaotic or stressful, or there's like environmental pollutions or overwhelm, like their digestion is going to be impacted. So true nourishment is both about the physical food that we intake, but then also all of the other things that are in our environment that we're in. So if you're curious about this perspective, one of the simplest ways to start to begin this sort of practice is really just by observing your own experiences. So you may keep a food journal, and you may just jot down what it is that you eat and keep track of how you're eating before your meals. So are you hungry? Were you stressed? Were you starving? How are you feeling while you're eating? And then also, how are you feeling right after you eat? And so the goal with this is not to judge yourself or to be really critical about yourself or to micromanage all of the notes, but just simply to cultivate awareness, because that awareness is really the first step towards change. So if you're interested in exploring this topic more deeply, which I hope that you are because I love this topic so much, I've got an upcoming workshop in person in Colorado Springs where I look more at food and fluid through an Ayurvedic lens. And then please know I offer individualized Ayurvedic consultations that we can do in person or virtually for those that want some more personalized guidance. But remember that whenever or wherever it is that you begin, food is not something to manage. It's something that we're in relationship to, and that relationship is really a profound source of healing. So thanks for joining me. Stay tuned because I'll be sharing more, and I look forward to being with you all soon. Okay, bye.